my friends, and welcome to the Personal Responsibility Lawyer Podcast. I am your host, Michael Lovins of the law firm Lovins Trosclair. And at Lovins Trosclair, we represent people who have been seriously injured or the loved ones of people who have actually suffered death at the hands of the irresponsible acts of others. Most people would refer to us as personal injury lawyers, which is correct, but we try cases from a personal responsibility perspective, and thus the title of this podcast. I am very excited today to have a former economics professor of mine from many years ago when I was an undergrad student at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. My guest today is Dr. Nathan Balke. He is the 2007 Dedman Family Distinguished Professor of Economics at SMU, and he's been there for quite some time, long enough that he was there when I was a student, and that was before we were doing online Zoom classes. He has also been a research scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas for many years, and it is important to note at the front that he is here not speaking on behalf of the Federal Reserve or the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas or anyone else. He's going to offer his opinions and is not speaking in any official capacity. So first of all, Professor Balke, thank you very much, and welcome to the Personal Responsibility Lawyer.
Well, thank you, Michael. I'm very happy to be here. I wish the overall circumstances were better, but I'm happy to be here.
Well, yeah. But if overall circumstances were better, we would be in a dramatically different world. And economics has, for better or worse, gotten a whole lot more interesting in the last couple of months because we are in uncharted territory for sure. And obviously, if someone's listening to this 2 years from now, I suppose we should be clear because this is going to live on the internet for hopefully a long time. We're talking about the coronavirus. We are all basically in quarantine, shelter-in-place orders, almost every state of the country, certainly in Texas, where both Professor Balke and I live. And we have essentially shut down massive portions of the economy to deal with this coronavirus pandemic. And so what we're going to talk about today are the economic effects of that and how are we going to dig our way out. And so I guess one of the first things, Professor, is you know Federal Reserve stuff well. One of the first things that happened was the Federal Reserve cut interest rates. We hear a lot if you listen to media and economic news, you hear about discussions about what the Fed may do with interest rates, raise them, lower them, whatever. They cut them to pretty close to zero, which is almost unthinkable. But what does that really mean? Because one thing I know is that my mortgage rate is still what it was before, and that's not zero. So what does it mean when the Fed cuts or raises rates, and how does that affect an average person?
Michael, before I answer that question, kind of maybe sort of give you a sense of what the big picture is, and then I'll answer that question specifically.
Absolutely.
So the way to think about the coronavirus is that this is a huge decline in work across the economy. My view is it's largely going to be temporary, but right now we've had 16 million people file for unemployment claims in the last 3 weeks. There's guesses that the unemployment rate will go to 15, perhaps 20. I've even seen an estimate of 30%. So that's huge decline in work. And so you can think about the policy responses to this huge decline in work is kind of one of the questions you're asking about. Again, I think the key idea here is that this decline in work is temporary. That I think in a year and a half, 2 years, we'll have a vaccine. That the sort of work stoppages that we see right now are not going to be indefinite. And so, what we want to do is think about what should we do as a policy response to this very sharp decline in economic activity, that is temporary. So think about that's the kind of the big policy questions. How should we respond to this big temporary decline in work? So let me lay out a couple of general principles in terms of how to think about a policy response, and then we can talk specifically about what the Fed was doing. Would that be okay?
Absolutely.
So think about with a big temporary decline in work, so people's incomes are going to be falling dramatically as they can't work, or employers because they've lost customers cannot hire their workers, and so you're going to have a big decline in income for a lot of people in this economy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, generally, if you have a big decline in income, one thing you'd like to do is to smooth that decline in income over time. You can't get rid of it, right? Because essentially you're not working. A lot of people are not working. And so there's going to be a decline in income, period. But what you would like to do is, if you could, for an individual, smooth this income loss out over time. So if I'm earning $50,000 and I lose my job and my income goes to zero, that's a lot more painful than if I could borrow, money to keep me going over several years, and then pay back that loan in the future. And so, if people could borrow to smooth this big temporary decline in income, that would make this episode a lot less painful. Of course, the problem is everybody wants to borrow at the same time. So you've got millions of people that would like to borrow, right? And it becomes difficult because who's going to lend, right? When everybody wants to borrow. So think about one principle is then we'd like to smooth out this loss in income that is going to be happening to millions of people. And then the second thing is if you think about a modern economy, there are millions of economic relationships between workers and employers, between suppliers and customers, between landlords and renters, between debtors and creditors. There's millions of these economic relationships, and it takes a while to establish them. These relationships could be formal or informal contracts. So forming and maintaining and severing these relationships is difficult to do. And you can think about what the law profession does is, in some sense, help people maintain and orderly dissolve relationships, economic relationships.
Usually with fairly high transaction costs.
Yes. So what you don't want to have happen is a whole severing lots of these relationships all at the same time. In some sense, it would be good. It's good for economy for there to be kind of a steady, constant severing and reestablishing of relationships. And that is because that's how growth happens, right? You get a new product, you get a new job, you get a new company. That's kind of evidence of economic dynamism and growth. And so you want a little bit of this disruptions to be happening all the time. But what you don't want to have happen is a huge disruption in these economic relationships. Because as you mentioned, it's costly to establish these relationships. It's hard to find a good worker. It's hard to find a good employer. You've got, these relationships are hard to establish, and it's important for them to be maintained. So what you don't want then is to have a huge decline or a huge disruption in all these relationships in this economy. And so that's kind of what's been happening, right? So we've had people losing their jobs. You think about the ventilators that are in short supply. They're made by hundreds. They're made of hundreds of different parts, produced by hundreds of different companies. If one of those suppliers goes under, then it becomes difficult to make the entire ventilator. And so these kinds of disruptions in these economic relationships imply problems for the entire economy. And so think about what policy should do is to try to, first of all, smooth out the pain of this big loss in income that results because people can't work. And then the second thing policy should do is try to prevent there being major disruptions in all these economic relationships that are the key to economic activity in a modern economy. All right, so that's kind of a long-winded kind of introduction to kind of set up how to think about policy.
Mm-hmm.
So now, what did the Fed do when this started? So there's kind of a couple of things. So the Fed's its policy is going to try to help smooth out this income loss, and to help smooth out this income loss, it'll need to make it easier for people to borrow and lend, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so one way you can think about in Fed's overall perspective here is to try to ensure that credit can continue to flow to households, to businesses, even state and local governments. Now, the other thing the Fed needs to do is to make sure that the financial system doesn't collapse.
Right.
Right. Because if the financial system collapses, then it'll be very difficult for households and businesses and local governments to get funding. And so think about the Fed's overall objective is to prevent a collapse in the financial system. So what did the Fed do? What did the Fed do initially was it bought billions of dollars of government securities, mortgage-backed securities, and now just yesterday it's going to announce that it's going to spend $2 trillion in buying corporate government debt and state and local municipal debt. So what the Fed is doing is buying billions of dollars of assets, and how it does that is, I'll use the kind of term colloquially, it prints money. And so it's ejecting billions of dollars into the financial system. Now, why is this useful? Well, I think it's largely to prevent what I would call a run on money.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about the toilet paper, I'm sorry, go ahead.
With a question there. So one of the things, if you study anything about the Great Depression, you know that there were runs on banks.
Yes.
We don't use cash the way they did then. Can you take a quick detour to compare what a run on money looked like then as compared to what it would look like now?
Yeah. So think about money in a pretty broad way. So your deposits at a bank, you can think about them as money as well. Mm-hmm. As long as somebody's willing to, take those deposits in exchange for goods and services, you can think about those deposits as money. So think about money in a broad way. It's sort of what you need to have to buy stuff with. Now, I'm going to kind of think about money in this broader way. It would include things like cash. It would include things like debit accounts. It would include things like checking accounts. And you think about the resources that you need to buy goods and services. So think of that as money. Mm-hmm. So when the coronavirus started hitting people's consciousness, think about in early March, mm-hmm. there was what I would call a run on toilet paper.
Right.
So everybody ran to the store and bought toilet paper. Now, why did they do this? Well, they did it not because they needed to use toilet paper now. It's because they were worried in the future there would be no toilet paper available. And in anticipation of that, then they ran to the store, bought toilet paper, and created a shortage in toilet paper today. Mm-hmm. And it was this fear about what would happen in the future, right, that caused people to run to the store and buy toilet paper. So now think about this in terms of money. So if people get worried and they're afraid that, in the future, I'm going to need money, I'll need cash, then, and they're worried that they may not be able to get that cash in the future when they think they need it, they're going to go ahead and get cash today. So that would include sort of thinking about, well, how do I get cash? How do I get money? I sell assets. Mm-hmm. I don't buy stuff. I withdraw my cash from the bank. I think about I'm going to try to get as much cash today, even though I don't need it today.
Right.
I'm going to try to get a lot of cash today. And to do that, I'll need to sell assets. And when you sell assets, then the price of those assets falls. So we saw in March really steep, rapid declines in stock prices, and interesting in a lot of other assets as well. And you can think about this as evidence that people were trying to unload these assets so that they, in some sense, could get cash today in anticipation of bad things happening in the future.
Right.
And this is kind of, if you thought about what happened in the Great Depression, this is also the kinds of things that happened in the Great Depression. Right? In there, the Great Depression, the run on money was characterized by runs on banks, and you had, banks collapse and fail. That caused a ripple effect throughout the entire economy. So think about now this run on money, and what did the Fed do? Well, by going out and buying billions of dollars of assets, in some sense, the Fed prevented this run on money. It didn't stop stock market from going down entirely, but it sort of stopped the steep decline in asset prices. So the Fed goes out, buys billions of dollars of assets, right? What that's doing is injecting lots and lots of money into the financial system. And so that, unlike the toilet paper example, we don't run out of money because the Fed is essentially injecting trillions of dollars of new money into the financial system. And that helps stabilize asset prices. It helps stabilize the balance sheets of financial institutions. And it also, if you think about it now, there's all this sort of what we call bank reserves floating in the banking system that's been injected by the Fed. And these are kind of resources that banks could lend out if they chose to lend out. Right? And so think about, in the process of injecting all these billions of dollars into the financial system, it kind of as a side effect, that drove key interest rates that the Fed sets close to zero. Right? But the big thing was that it injected all these billions of money into new money into the financial system. And I would sort of characterize that as that prevented a run on money, right? Similar to what we had in the Great Depression. So it's kind of a very long-winded answer to your question, but by the Fed going out and buying billions of dollars of assets, when it does that, it is kind of, again, colloquially printing money and putting that money into the financial system, right? And in the course of doing that, it drove the interest rates on these, interest rates to close to zero.
So whose borrowing rate? How does that cut in interest rates trickle through? And I guess I have two pretty separate questions here. That's the first one, and the second one is that we heard back in quantitative easing, we heard about the government printing money. I don't think that's a literal printing anymore. Maybe back during the Great Depression, if they were to do that, it would be a more literal, actually printing dollar bills. What does it mean when the government or the Fed literally creates money?
Yeah, so you're right. What the Fed doesn't do is it doesn't technically print money like it printed off the printing press.
Right.
What it does is it creates what are called reserves. And think about reserves are deposits that banks have at the Fed. So think about the Fed as a bank for banks. And so the Fed will create new deposits, right, by buying government securities. Those deposits are going to end up into the banking system, and the banks will take these deposits and deposit them into the Federal Reserve, and we call those reserves. And so it's all done electronically now.
Right.
So it's just electrons being moved around on computers. but again, I think the intuition is, colloquially, it would be, it's kind of like the Fed is creating money out of thin air, and that's basically what it's doing. It's creating money out of thin air, because you could use these deposits, right? So let's do a specific example. So
Yeah.
I'm the Fed, and I'm going to buy $1 million worth of bonds. Right, and these could be government securities, it could be now corporate bonds, it could be mortgage-backed securities. I go to a bond trader and I buy these bonds from a bond trader, and then what I will do is I will credit their account at their bank with a $10 million credit. Right, and as far as that bond trader is concerned, then they now have $10 million worth of deposits in their bank. Now, that bank also has now this deposits, right? It has $10 million of electronic deposits. And what it will do is then take some of that, right, and deposit that into the Fed. So think about it as a checking account that a bank has with the Fed. And that means then the reserves in the banking system have risen as that bank takes that deposit and puts it into its checking account at the Fed. And so bank reserves would have gone up by $10 million when the Fed made that $10 million bond purchases. So that's what we mean by the Fed changing the amount of money, because think about deposits as a form of money.
Right.
And think about reserves as these deposits that banks have with the Fed. And so when the Fed buys government securities, it changes the amount of reserves that are in the banking system. So go. I'm sorry. So to go back to your question about the interest rates. So the interest rates that the Fed can directly control are things like the Fed funds rate, and this is the interest rate that banks charge to one another when they borrow and lend reserves, essentially overnight. So when the Fed funds rate goes to zero, that doesn't change your mortgage rate, because your mortgage rate was set previously in a contract that you've entered into with your lender. And so that doesn't change your interest rate, because that interest rate's already fixed. However, if you went to refinance your mortgage, you could probably find a new mortgage, right, with a lower interest rate, because the interest rates in general have fallen as a result of the Fed's actions. So you're absolutely right. It doesn't change your interest rate, but it changes the interest rates if you decided to refinance your mortgage. And that may make you more willing to buy a house if you or renovate your house or whatever, if you could get a mortgage at a lower interest rate than what you're currently paying. And so that's the kind of idea, is that how interest rates, by the Fed lowering interest rates, might be able to spur economic activity.
So when we talk about the Fed essentially creates money, it seems, and I know this is not the case, but it seems like we should be able to say, well, shoot, let's just all go on lockdown indefinitely. Forget worrying about coming up. Just print money, and we'll inject that money into the economy. We'll give it to people who lose their jobs, and everything's going to be fine. I know that's false. Why is it false? Why can't we do that forever?
So one thing is the thing about the coronavirus is, because people are not working, stuff isn't being made, and people aren't earning incomes. And so you can't get rid of those economic losses, right? They're there. Now, we can smooth out these economic losses, right, if they're temporary, by for an individual's point of view, by borrowing, right? If I lose my job for a month, if I could borrow to tide me over till when I go back to work, then I can smooth out that loss over many time periods, right? I'll have to pay back the loan for many periods in the future, right? And so what I'm doing is I'm smoothing out my loss, but I can't get rid of that loss, because I've got to pay back the loan. during that month that I was unemployed, I couldn't make stuff and I couldn't earn income. So I can do that if it's temporary. If it's permanent, I can't do that, right? If it's a permanent decline in work, right, an indefinite decline in work, then you can't smooth it out, right? The smoothing out assumes that you will have the resources in the future to sort of, in some sense, pay back your loan. And so permanent declines in work would not be, you wouldn't be able to smooth it out. And so the Fed doing this wouldn't really help. What you would end up with is basically prices changing, and this injecting lots of money would not really help the situation very much, because this is a permanent. If it were permanent, there's nothing much you can do. You're going to experience lower incomes indefinitely, and so it makes it impossible to smooth this decline in income. I don't know if that helps kind of get.
Well, if it's excuse me, if it's permanent, or for a, say it's a 2-year thing. Say it takes 2 years to get a vaccine and nobody can go out until we do. I don't think that is remotely the case, but I'm just setting up hypothetical here. In that case, okay, so I lose my job. I am not able to provide goods or services, and so that I have an economic loss. But if the Fed can create money, why doesn't the Fed just keep creating money and giving me that money to continue putting food on my table and paying my rent or whatever? That they can't do it. Maybe the distinction here is there's an economic loss that has to at some point correspond to the supply of money, and you can't just create money without some economic productivity that sort of backs it up in some sense.
Yeah.
But if you can create money, just keep creating money and give me money. In fact, why don't you just create money and make us all millionaires?
Right. I mean, let's add a zero onto all the money that we already have. It's kind of a way to think about it.
Yeah.
So, yes, that will not work indefinitely, because what will happen is essentially the price of goods in terms of money will just, go up. So think about if you added a zero to all your current dollar bills and all your current, holdings of money, eventually that would just translate into adding a zero to all the prices that you pay in terms of dollars. And you couldn't buy more stuff with that money because the price of that stuff has gone up by the same amount as the money has gone up. So if you double the amount of money, prices would eventually double. And you're right, because sort of more dollars floating around doesn't necessarily, right, mean that you're going to be producing more stuff if you can't go to work. Mm-hmm. The thing is that we might be able to minimize these disruptions if they were temporary by allowing people, right, in the short run to maintain their consumption, to maintain their incomes, maintain these economic relationships that I talked about earlier. And adding more dollars into the system might help that happen temporarily, but it won't fix it in an indefinite way. If this is a permanent decline in production of goods and services because we can't work like we used to be able to work, then throwing dollars at it won't help in the long run. It may help in the short run, and again, I think the Fed is trying to sort of help ameliorate the short run consequences, to minimize the disruptions in the economy, help people smooth out. it's not a permanent fix. The
Right.
only way you can really permanently fix this is get the coronavirus, under control and allow us to go back to work. If you can't get people to go back to work, no amount of dollars floating around is going to help in the long run.
So, to what extent do we, to the extent we know, how much do we expect the injection of money? Yeah. And sometimes when I'm asking questions, I realize there's like three other assumptions in here that I need to see if I'm right about first. So a couple of weeks ago, Congress passed this big relief bill, the Paycheck Protection Act, and some other things that's going to inject a bunch of money into the economy. A lot of it is giving businesses it's technically they're loans, but they're forgivable. So they will ultimately end up being just giving money to small businesses to then keep people employed. Is that part of the process of the Fed injecting money, or are these two separate things? How do they mesh together? I'm not sure that question's even coherent.
Yeah, no, but I think it makes sense. So you can think about part of this is an attempt to smooth out the income loss for individual businesses, individual households. And so one way to do that is to be able to borrow. And since this is affecting a lot of people at the same time, about the only possible lender that there would be something like the government. So the government is is lending to small businesses, even though these small businesses may never pay it back.
Right. In fact, there's provisions in there to say as long as you use this money for keeping employees paid, it's forgiven. They're not even contemplating most of that being paid back.
That's right. Now, who will eventually end up paying for those loans will be taxpayers in the future. So, but again, way to think about it is that it's smoothing out this loss to over time and over lots of different people in this economy.
Yeah.
And so future taxpayers are going to pay some of the costs of these injections of loans that are happening now. So you think about that. That's what the government's doing is helping smooth out the temporary negative consequences of dealing with the coronavirus. Whether it's enough or not, that'll depend. Now, that's a little bit different than what the Fed is doing. So the government, by doing these small business loans, is not necessarily changing the amount of dollars floating around the economy. It's when the Fed goes out and buys assets. So these are like government bonds, mortgage-backed securities, corporate bonds, other kinds of bonds. There, the Fed will actually create money. And again, I think the Fed did that to prevent sort of collapse of the financial system, to prevent the run on money. These are other issues. These other programs, these loans, I think of it as ways to help smooth out the pain of the coronavirus.
How much should we expect all of this injection of money from the relief package and from the Fed? Is it going to push inflation up? Are we at or near a point where we should worry about inflation, or is it not going to have that big of an effect on inflation going forward?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't think we have a really good handle on that. If you had asked this question 15 years ago, I would have said, yeah, we're gonna sooner or later get a big burst in inflation as once we kind of get over this temporary decline in production, we're going to have a big burst of inflation unless the Fed takes the money out of the system. But the financial crisis of 2008, 2009 also saw a big injection of money into the financial system. And we didn't get that burst of inflation then. So I think in principle, if the Fed continued to sort of do trillions and trillions and trillions of additional dollars, putting those dollars into the financial system, eventually prices are going to change and we're going to respond to that, and we're going to see a bout of inflation. How much would the Fed have to inject for inflation to take off? That's a hard question to know, and I think we've been continually surprised about this for the last 10, 15 years. So I can't really answer that question. Yeah. I don't think we have a good handle on it. I think in principle, there's a point at which, inflation's going to take off if the Fed continues to inject billions of dollars into the economy. But where that point is, it's really hard to know. And I think the profession's views have changed on this over the last 15 years.
And I'm going to refer back to our email correspondence in getting ready for this, but you made a statement that the total impact of the coronavirus will be dramatically different from the direct impact. Can you explain the total versus direct and why they will be dramatically different?
So go back to this sort of notion about relationships. So if you just thought about a temporary decline in work, because that's basically the direct effect, because of the public health considerations, we're telling people you can't go to work. If that didn't result in severing long-standing economic relationships, then once we get the coronavirus under control, then the economy should bounce back very rapidly. We should see a really strong recovery. However, if these economic relationships get severed, right, and you lost your employees because now they're out looking for other jobs, you've lost the supplier because they've gone bankrupt, lots of different ways that you could sever economic relationships. It's going to take quite a bit of time to reestablish those economic relationships. And then the economy may not bounce back so quickly. And so you're going to get an extended phase where the economy recovers slowly, right? Even though the kind of work restrictions of the coronavirus have been lifted. And in that sense, then the recovery from the virus could be quite long and difficult. Again, if you think about what happened after the Great Depression, it took a decade to recover from the Great Depression, largely because of all the relationships that were severed as a result of the financial collapse. And so there's a danger of that happening here. The longer this goes on, the more economic relationships that are severed, the danger is that this effect will last longer than just the work stoppage.
Does the hyperconnectedness of our economy and the electronic, digitization of so much of it, but it's also much more complex than what the economy was in 1929. Is the state of our economy now, does it make it easier or harder to reestablish those relationships once they're severed?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are more complex relationships now. I think each individual relationship is perhaps easier to establish and maintain, but these relationships are much more complicated. So think about that example of the ventilator. So those ventilators are made with hundreds of parts from all around the world. It's easier to establish these kinds of relationships now than it would have been in 1929. But of course, they're much more complex. So any one of those suppliers that make parts for the ventilator, if they are unable to provide the parts, then it may mean you don't get the ventilator made. So it's kind of a both. It's easier to establish individual relationships, but we have more of them. The things are more complex, and so any link in the chain, it makes us perhaps more vulnerable to any link in that chain breaking, and then causing much more disruptions.
Yeah, I suppose that it's fairly simple to get to reestablish a relationship for a low skilled type service or employment, because there's a lot of people who can do that. But if you have a complex part on a ventilator, not just, you can't call me and say, hey, I need ventilator parts, start making them now. I can't do that. I don't know what I'm doing. So I guess the complexity of the ventilator itself makes reestablishing that relationship a more difficult and time-consuming sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it makes us more vulnerable. This interconnectedness is a benefit in the sense that we can have these complicated ventilators at relatively low prices, but it makes us, more susceptible to disruptions. We really haven't had an experience like this. This is like the first time this has happened since we kind of entered into this hyperconnectivity. We need to, in the future, sort of be at least sensitive to the strengths, but also the weakness of this interconnectivity.
Is there a way to predict, okay, so we've been shut down for X number of weeks, we can go X plus Y weeks before, I guess, to figure out how many of these relationships are being severed, and therefore it's going to, the hopeful V-shaped recovery becomes less and less V-shaped and more of a protracted U-shaped recovery. Is there any way to, other than saying, well, the longer we're shut down, the worse it's going to be, is there any way to measure or predict this?
I think it's really hard to sort of give a quantitative number. So, do we go 1 more month? Do we go 2 more months? I think that what we should be thinking about is thinking about how can we go back to work in a reasonably safe way.
Right.
I think we need to start doing that now. We need to sort of think about what kind of protocols should businesses follow that would allow them to open, but minimize the risks of further contagion. We're not going to make that zero. We can't expect to have 0 new cases, but we can expect to sort of try to minimize this risk of continued infection. That's just going to be a question that's going to be answered, I think, through the political process, and it's going to be. It's hard to sort of say, in 2 months we should be ready to go. I think we should be making plans to go now. That is, we should begin to start thinking about going back to work, but doing it in a safe way that kind of mitigates most of the dangers of continued infection. But we need to sort of think about how do we go back to work. And a lot of that is, your podcast is about responsibility. A lot of that is about the responsibility of individual businesses and consumers and workers, right? So what kind of actions do I need to do? What kind of responsible actions should I need to do to enable me to go back to work, to service customers, but minimize the health implications of continued infection? And that may vary from business to business, right? Sure. But it's a really hard question, and we need to start thinking about it. What kinds of how we can go back to work, even though there still be the virus circulating. We won't have a vaccine for a year or 2, perhaps, and so we need to figure out how to get back to work sooner. And that's a hard problem, but it's something that people need to be talking about and thinking about, policymakers.
Are there economic excuse me, are there economic policies that can make it easier? It's tough because economists don't tend to know much about public health, and public health experts don't tend to know much about economics. But there's a massive integration between these two fields right now. Is there economic policy that can sort of grease the wheels of reestablishing some of these relationships, or maybe somehow preserving some of them? I don't really even have, unless you have something like you have a mandated pushing sort of push the pause button on mortgages. So, okay, if somebody loses their job, they can't pay their mortgage. It just gets their 30-year mortgage becomes a 30-year and 3-month mortgage, or whatever however long we're shut down. Is that, as an economic policy, set aside, there may be constitutional issues and government power issues and things of that nature. Economically, is there a reasonable way, if there's unlimited government power, to do something like that? I'm not sure I think it's a good idea. I'm just trying to think through how we manage our way out of this.
Yeah, I think it would be better if sort of individual parties could do some of this voluntarily. Now, that's not always possible, but there has been a sense of forbearance that, it might be possible to get your mortgage company to agree to postpone your mortgage payments for a quarter or 6 months or something like that. There's this sense that there's this forbearance that we might be able to encourage. I think a lot of what the government trying to sort of smooth out the income loss of people, that's through unemployment compensation, through small business loans, by lending to companies and industries that have been severely affected by the coronavirus. These are all attempts to kind of help businesses, households maintain these relationships during this sort of I'll call it a temporary disruption. Mm-hmm. It would be a lot harder to sort of say to tell to sort of force mortgage companies to sort of say, oh, okay, we're going to push back the length of the loan by 3 months, because it would violate all kinds of contracts that have already been established.
Right.
By violating the contracts, that in some sense breaks the relationships that had been established, and that in some sense could be costly in and of itself. Yeah. It's most of the policies that we've been talking about are macro policies, right? Sort of lots of business loans and the Fed putting money into the financial system. These are kind of macro policies. The relationships part is really kind of the microeconomics. It's just like one-on-one, supplier and producer and customer and business firm, renter and landlord. It's these relationships are kind of one-on-one. And this macro policy stuff can't really affect that stuff directly. It can, in some sense, help individuals decide to maintain those relationships. But again, it's the individuals that are going to actually make that decision. Do we close? Do we lay off our workers? Do we close shop? Do I default on my loan payments? Those are all individual decisions. And I think it would be counterproductive for the government to get involved at the individual level. I think we can encourage these relationships by giving people the means to smooth out this sort of temporary decline in economic activity. But I would be much more reluctant for the government to get involved on a kind of individual basis.
Is there we talk a lot about this being uncharted territory, and I think that is as we tend to overstate things a lot, but I don't think this is an overstatement. Is there some episode in economic history that economists are looking at and saying, okay, well, this wasn't exactly the same, but this is what these are specific instances that we can learn from and maybe apply the lessons that we learned back in such and such a time? Or is it just genuinely we're using sort of broad economic principles to try to figure out what happens in this situation?
There's a couple of episodes that I think from the public health standpoint we learned from. So one is the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, and in that case, there have been studies that have shown that social distancing worked then. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's helped with the public health response. We didn't shut down the economy like we did in this episode. And I think, maybe it's just society was more willing or able to tolerate kind of the effects of a pandemic on public health than we are willing to do that today. If we had done nothing, if we'd done nothing to shut down the economy, perhaps the effect of the coronavirus would be shorter lived. But of course, so would lots of millions of people as well, right? And so I think in this time we've sort of erred on the side of public health rather than the kind of purely economic consequences. A second example that kind of gets at this is in 1957 there was an outbreak of the Asian flu. We called it the Asian flu. And it wasn't quite as deadly as the coronavirus, in terms of death rates. But it did have a big impact on, kind of public health. I think somewhere around 100,000 people died as a result of it. So we're talking about kind of numbers of deaths that are going to perhaps be comparable to what we're going to see here, but they didn't do the public health measures that we did, the lockdowns. Nonetheless, we still had a recession in 1957. It didn't last long, but we still had a recession as a result of the Asian flu. So we've had some experience, but I think we've taken measures this time around that we haven't really done in the past. Basically shutting down work like we've done is something that we haven't done before. We've experienced these pandemics, and in fact, as human society's gone through these pandemics, on a periodical basis, and we generally recover eventually. But of course, there's quite a bit of misery in the course of the pandemic.
At this point, and we're near the end of we could talk about this all day, and as much as you taught me 20 some years ago, you could teach me all the rest of the day, and I'd still be just beginning to learn some of this stuff and figure it out. But I'm gonna kind of put you on the spot at the end and say, do you have any sort of prediction as to is this going to be a quick recovery? Is it going to be a long and painful recovery? Or do we have any way of predicting that yet? And then I know I'm throwing like 20 questions into one question. What metric or set of metrics do we look at to try to predict whether we're going to have a slow or a fast recovery?
Yeah, I'm actually fairly optimistic that if we can get I'll make my answer conditional. If we can get kind of the spread of the virus.
No, hold on. I'm the lawyer. I'm the one who gets to say it depends.
If we can get the virus under control, then I actually think that the economy can bounce back fairly quickly. if we get recurring waves of infection and recurring waves of shutting down work, then this kind of recovery can be prolonged. But I'm relatively optimistic that we're going to have a pretty strong recovery after we kind of just opened up the economy to work. I think that could happen in the third quarter. So I expect that we're going to be sort of muddling along here for another month or so, getting into the summer. By the third quarter, I think that we should be having positive growth and hopefully a pretty robust recovery.
Well, since I like to end on as positive a note as I can, and lately the coronavirus pandemic has given us more sour notes, that seems like a fantastic place to close this discussion. Professor Balke, thank you so much for taking the time to come on with me today and give us some education about the macroeconomic issues with the coronavirus.
Well, Michael, I enjoyed it very much, and it's always good to hear from former students, and thank you.
Thank you very much. For the Personal Responsibility Lawyer and for Lovins Trosclair, I am Michael Lovins, and we will see you next time. Thank you for listening to the Personal Responsibility Lawyer podcast. You can get more information about the show, including my show notes, at the personal website, michaellovins.com. If you like what you've heard or if you've learned something interesting, please do me a massive favor and rate the show on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really does help. This episode of The Personal Responsibility Lawyer is brought to you by my law firm, Lovins Trosclair, where we use the civil justice system to hold people responsible for irresponsible choices when those irresponsible choices cause serious injuries and sometimes even death. We're personal injury trial lawyers, but I use the term personal responsibility lawyer because it connotes a different approach to presenting a case to a jury. I really, really hope that you never need a personal injury lawyer, but if you do, please call us before evidence gets lost or destroyed. You can reach my office at 512-535-1649. Tell us you heard about us on the Personal Responsibility Lawyer podcast. You can also go to our website for Lovins Trosclair at ltlegalteam.com. That's L as in Lovins, T as in Trosclair, legalteam.com. We are here to help. Now I have to do some disclaimers where I say stuff that you already knew, but that I must say anyway so that I keep the state bar happy. Here we go. This podcast is not legal advice. You listening to this podcast does not make me your lawyer or you my client. Neither does it make any of my guests your lawyer. If you want me to be your lawyer, contact me at my office. If I can represent you, we will execute a contract stating the specific terms under which I agree to represent you. I don't think you probably needed me to tell you that, but I did. Also, I'm not certified by the Texas Board of Legal Specialization as a personal responsibility lawyer because they don't have any idea what that is. Neither have they certified me in any other area of specialty that they actually do recognize. I think that wraps up our disclaimers for now. For Lovins Trosclair and the Personal Responsibility Lawyer podcast, I am Michael Lovins.